Good evening. I am Ben Needham, and I have the pleasure of introducing our host this evening, Jamal Simmons. Jamal has spent most of his career at the nexus of politics and media. He's currently a political contributor to CBS News and the host of This Is FYI, which can be viewed on Instagram TV and Facebook. Until recently, Jamal produced and hosted several segments of Hill TV, where he interviewed presidential candidates, congressional leaders, celebrities, and activists. And before joining CBS, Jamal was a regular on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. During his career, Jamal helped elect President Bill Clinton and President Barack Obama. Jamal has degrees from Morehouse College and Harvard University. Please welcome CBS contributor and This Is FYI host, Jamal Simmons.
But thanks so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here in what is really one of the most remarkable times I think we've faced as a country, certainly probably since about World War II. We've never had the entire country be so focused around a set of challenges that we all have to face, particularly, the COVID-19 crisis that we're all facing. So, a couple of weeks ago, we lost a hero. We lost John Lewis. John Lewis obviously is known for his work in taking the civil rights movement forward and helping to get past the Civil Rights Act of 1965. This is now the 55th anniversary of that Civil Rights Act. And so as we try to navigate another presidential election, we are faced with forces that are trying to make voting more complicated. We're also faced with invisible disease that is really affecting so many people, so many families, so many husbands, mothers, sons, daughters, sisters, brothers, people who have really been challenged in the losses that we've all taken on. So that makes things very complicated as voters start to think about what to do in November and how to engage their electorate. So voting by mail is one of those options that is going to hopefully make this a little bit more of an orderly process if we can make it all work out. So I want to thank everybody for having me, from the Human Rights Campaign Foundation to the NAACP, UnidosUS, Latino Victory. I want to thank you all for having me be a part of this. I'm going to introduce you right now to Alphonso David. He's the president of the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. And Alphonso is the first civil rights lawyer and first person of color to occupy the center seat at the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. Alphonso, thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you for a minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamal, for hosting, and thank you for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. As you heard, my name is Alphonso David, and I am the president of the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, which is the largest lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer civil rights organization in the world. On behalf of myself and my fellow panelists from the NAACP, from Unidos, and from the Latino Victory Foundation, I want to welcome you to tonight's event. Tonight, as you heard, on the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, we are here to recognize the power of individuals as visionaries for a more just and loving world, and how our communities can and must make that vision a reality by taking action at the ballot box. Our organizations have a long history of supporting and advancing voting rights in this country, which is why on the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, we continue to call for its renewal to protect the right to vote for everyone. Voters across the country this fall will be facing unprecedented challenges in how to safely make their voices heard in the pivotal election ahead. And we know that voters of color, including LGBTQ voters, face additional hurdles because of shameful, long-standing systems of oppression. It is therefore critical that we educate and empower our communities, and all communities, in how they can safely make sure that their voices are heard, and we can effectively make sure that the future of our democracy reflects our voices. A key part of voter education and empowerment means meeting people where they are. Through multiple research projects at the Human Rights Campaign, we have identified a common theme for marginalized communities in terms of concerns around safe and secure voting in November. We know, and we've known for quite some time, that we had to explore what was causing those concerns to ensure that everyone who wants to vote can vote in November. This was research that we did not see anywhere. And it was research that we knew would be vital to understanding the real and perceived barriers our communities face, as well as how we can overcome them. This is why our organizations, in partnership with HIT Strategies, came together to research how people of color voters view the upcoming election and how they will be casting their ballots, particularly around vote by mail. The results of this research reveal key commonalities as well as key differences in how voters from different communities view the current voting climate. As we will discuss in more detail tonight, one powerful similarity between all the voters we surveyed is hope. That in spite of the darkness and the challenges of these times, voters are hopeful, resilient, and ready to cast their votes this November, from the ballot box to the mailbox. The late John Lewis wrote, "Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we want and what we call the beloved community, a nation and a world society at peace with itself." I look at this amazing panelist of builders from the organizations that we've worked with, of people of action, of visionaries of equality, and I look at the people protesting in the streets for racial justice and equality, who are showing us the country we can be. They are carrying on the legacy of John Lewis and C.T. Vivian and our elders in the struggle like Bayard Rustin, Sylvia Rivera, Yuri Koshimaya, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, who understood that together, united, si se puede. They are giving all of us hope and inspiring us to act. Let us be the next generation of builders, and let's start with our vote. Once again, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight, and I will now turn it back over to Jamal.
Okay, thanks a lot, Alphonso. And thank you for your leadership in pulling this all together. Right now, I want to introduce Terrence Woodbury. Terrence is the co-founder and partner at HIT Strategies, where he focuses on millennials and people of color, doing research around that. He's our primary researcher for the data that we've got to pick through tonight. He also is a fellow Morehouse man. So I'm going to turn it over to Terrence.
Thank you so much, Jamal. First I want to thank our fantastic partners, HRC Foundation, NAACP, Latino Victory Foundation, Unidos, and Woke Vote for commissioning this incredible research project. And thank you to all of the fearless leaders on this panel that continue forging the life's work of one of my heroes, John Lewis. Improving access to voting is certainly good trouble that I'm honored to get into with each of you. And pull up the slide, please. HIT Strategies lives and works at the intersection of many of these communities and have dedicated all of our efforts this cycle to ensure that they achieve their full political power. Next slide, please. So far too often, people of color are reduced to a single column of a crosstab. Many of us practitioners have had to deal with this, where we have to make all of our decisions, strategies, and investments into communities of color based on a single column in a crosstab, POC. This research attempts to really reflect the full diversity of the electorate, and intimately and ensured all of the target audiences are adequately represented by intimately involving all of the research partners in every step of the research design, by conducting LGBTQ, African American, millennial, minority, and Spanish-speaking focus groups, and by conducting a survey with a 1,600 sample of only voters of color, with specific oversamples of Black, Latinx, AAPI, and LGBTQ voters of color. Next slide, please. So this came from one of our focus groups conducted across southern states. And we asked the question, what do you know about the process to vote by mail? I barely trust voting in person. I definitely do not trust mailing anything in. It's just too easy to commit fraud related to mail-in ballots. Voters of color possess a justifiable cynicism towards the election system. And that cynicism certainly extends to the vote by mail voting system. This is the charge of this research, to cut through this cynicism and discover methods and messages that increase the confidence and likelihood of voters of color to vote by mail. Next slide, please. So let's start with the messages. Here's some messaging guidance of what to say to encourage people of color to vote by mail. First, we should anchor to COVID-19 and the safety and security that voting by mail creates. We should also harness the increasing hope, optimism, and resilience of the community, of minority communities. Third, we should demonstrate how the accessibility of voting by mail has already increased participation of underrepresented communities. We should also demonstrate how vote by mail has already reduced voter fraud in states that conduct vote by mail elections. And finally, when referencing how vote by mail has already improved the voting process, the messages that we use should include location, statistics, and dates. This type of verifiable information cuts through the cynicism that requires voters to trust a system and lends to a verifiable proof that it's happening and working elsewhere. But there are also some things that we should avoid in our messaging. We should avoid discussing vote by mail as being more convenient. That was just a bridge too far in many of our focus groups. There's a nuanced but important difference between convenience and accessibility, and we will describe that later through some of our sample messaging. And finally, we should avoid discussing vote by mail as a community or social event. While our voters did cite voting as something that should be done with children to demonstrate civic responsibility, voting is otherwise perceived as a private or personal experience. Next slide, please. So let's focus on some of the methods as well. Programming guidance and things that we must do to encourage people of color to vote by mail. First, we have to invest in early public education to targeted audiences, explaining the process in vivid detail. Second, specifically amongst younger voters, there must be emphasis on the cost and locations to purchase postage online and or in person. This is a critical step that we can't skip, as many young voters have never purchased postage and actually have to be instructed where and how. And the cost is important because it is prohibitive for some young people that they have to pay to vote. So understanding the very low barrier of cost here is important. Third, we should use testimonials of people from our target communities that have already voted by mail to describe the benefits. I keep emphasizing have already, because far too often we make promises to communities of color of the outcome of elections, promises that have far too often return void. And so it's much easier and much more effective in our messaging and in our tactics to point to things that have already been done. And in our focus groups, we had one person who unsolicited held up their ballot in a room full of people who were very reluctant to vote by mail, who all expressed doubts and lack of confidence in the system. And that person, who they did not know for longer than the 30 minutes that they were in that focus group, just holding up his ballot and showing it to them made all of them more likely to consider it. Which brings me to the final point here, is that we have to show images of the ballot, of postage, and of websites that provide mail-in ballot services. Just showing these images makes vote by mail more familiar and more accessible to voters of color that otherwise have never participated in that process. Next slide, please. While some voters still feel anxious, discouraged, and nervous, the plurality of voters of color feel hopeful. This creates a messaging opportunity to harness this optimism into aspirational messaging, as opposed to them feeling angry, where we would have to use employ messages like "enough is enough" or "not on our watch." We can point to more aspirational messages, and I want to point to a quote here from one of our focus groups, where a young lady told us, "I have just been seeing what is happening all over the country with police shootings and protests, and it feels like people are actually paying attention now. So I'm optimistic that we might actually do the change that we have been talking about. We can harness that energy and mobilize communities of color through that energy." Next slide, please. Thinking about the presidential election in November, how confident are you that the election will be conducted fairly and accurately? Almost half of voters of color do not trust this election to be conducted fairly and accurately. Lack of confidence in the integrity of this election is a cause for concern. This creates a barrier that our messaging must be intentional about overcoming. Next slide, please. What don't you trust about the vote by mail process? I just don't trust voting in Georgia, says an African-American male participant from the South. Just being honest, I'm still going to do it, but they've been stealing elections here for almost 2 decades. So why wouldn't they try to steal mail-in ballots? States like Georgia, Florida, and Wisconsin that have histories of making it harder for people to vote require additional education messaging that demonstrates how vote by mail has already made elections more secure in places like Washington State and in Oregon. They require messaging that shows them how they can track their ballot because those interventions cut through the cynicism and provide a method of verification for them. Next slide, please. What does the experience from the primary election tell you about what to expect in the general election? It's harder to vote because of the COVID issue. The Latino community specifically, and the Black one, they have always been the most affected. It is known and it is noticed, and it is the one we feel the most. Communities of color are acutely aware of how COVID-19 and subsequent changes to the election process affects them. And as a result, they are pursuing safer and more secure alternatives to cast their vote this election. Next slide, please. So how do you plan on voting in the upcoming election? Half of our voters, 48%, plan to vote by mail. 20% plan to vote in person before Election Day, and 28% plan to vote in person on Election Day. While almost half of voters of color currently plan to vote by mail in 2020, safety provisions must be made for the half that still plan to vote in person. Next slide, please. So we also asked not just about their likelihood to vote by mail, which we saw almost half of voters say currently that they're likely to vote by mail, but we also asked how likely would you be to vote by mail in the November election if we still do not have a cure or vaccine to coronavirus. A lack of a cure or vaccine for coronavirus by Election Day will result in 3/4 of all voters of color likely voting by mail. This includes 75% of Black voters, 74% of Latinx voters, 82% of AAPI voters report that they would be likely to vote by mail if we do not have a vaccine for coronavirus. That is an overwhelming majority of voters of color that are likely to vote by mail, since it's pretty clear that we will not have a cure in the next 30 days. Next slide, please. The patchwork of vote by mail processes from state to state adds an extra layer of complications, but there are a few vote by mail processes that are particularly prohibitive to voters of color. And so we exposed voters to a couple of different processes and asked them which one of these processes would reduce the likelihood that you would vote by mail or prevent you from voting by mail. Requiring a witness to sign the ballot would result in 46% of voters of color not voting by mail. Not having postage prepaid on the mail ballot would result in 34% of voters of color not voting by mail. If you are working in states with these kinds of requirements, we have to be even more deliberate about overcoming these barriers. While them reporting that they would be less likely to vote by mail does not mean that these voters would not vote at all. Our voters have expressed very real concerns about the health risk of voting in person. And so any barrier that removes the option of them voting by mail are barriers that we have to move out of the way. Next slide, please. You know, as behavioral scientists, we say that there are two ways of changing people's behavior. We can change their motivation to do something, or we could remove the barriers that prevent them from doing something. These are the barriers to vote by mail. We asked them to select the reasons that gave them the greatest pause or would make them oppose voting by mail. Top 3 reasons include that ballots would be lost or uncounted. Number 2, that it would increase voter fraud. And 3, that it would extend the vote counting process. This last one is important because it is in fact true. It takes about 6 times longer to count a mail-in ballot than an in-person ballot. And while this is not the point of this research, we should be very vigilant about this because longer vote counting processes on and after Election Day, which we should expect with millions of more people voting by mail, could be used to discredit the outcome of this election. And so that is something that we should openly talk about, that just because it takes longer does not mean that it is any less valid, and that we still must pursue safer and secure options. Next slide, please. So those were the barriers to vote by mail. These are the motivations. You know, we got to move the barriers, but we also got to give them some motivations. And so along with asking them to select all of the reasons that would prevent them from voting by mail, we also asked them to select the reasons that give them confidence or would make them support vote by mail in their state. And the top 3 reasons include vote by mail is safer, healthier alternative to vote during COVID-19. Number 2, that vote by mail offers flexibility for people who work, have children, or other obligations that prevent them from voting. And number 3, that vote by mail prevents the long lines, the broken machines, and change locations, or other tactics that suppress votes in underrepresented communities. These motivations, these reasons to increase support for vote by mail became the foundational elements of our messaging. Understanding that these were the greatest factors that would increase support, that would increase confidence, we layered these elements into our persuasive messaging that we will review again. Next slide, please. And so we talked through some of our message guidance already. The fact that we need to anchor to COVID-19 and reinforce the fact that this is a safer and secure option. The fact that we have to harness their hope and optimism and demonstrate how accessibility to voting by mail has already increased participation in underrepresented communities. And how we must demonstrate how vote by mail has already reduced voter fraud in states that are conducting vote by mail elections, and that we must do these things while referencing locations, statistics, and dates that are verifiable. But we also gave some sample messaging here that layers in some of these elements, and I want to read one of them to you. COVID-19 has disrupted every part of society. For the foreseeable future, including our elections. But that does not stop so many of us from making our voices heard through protests, and it will not stop us from doing it again on Election Day. That is why we have to take advantage of vote by mail, because it is the safest and most secure way to cast your vote without putting yourself or anyone else at risk. If we have to vote early, vote by mail, or stand in line wearing gloves and masks, all of our votes will be counted. And so we provide a couple of sampling messages here so that folks can start to layer in these message elements. And next slide, please. And of course, the programming guidance. And I want to point out some of the details here that I didn't get to cover in the first slide. Because while we do have to invest in early public education to target audiences, explaining the process in vivid detail, this process must include how to request a ballot, purchasing postage, tracking your ballot, very important. Any states that allow ballot tracking, this was one of the most effective ways of cutting through cynicism. They don't have to trust the mailman. They don't have to trust the post office. It is literally their responsibility and their right to track their ballot. That we have to emphasize with young voters how and where and how much it costs to purchase postage. That we should use testimonials of people from the target communities that have already voted by mail to describe the benefits of vote by mail, that it's safer during COVID, that it's an easy process, and that you can avoid work conflicts and avoid lines. And finally, we should show images of ballot postage and websites that provide the mail-in services. Just showing them images makes the process more familiar and more accessible. Next slide, please. Since many voters of color are thinking about vote by mail for the first time, we understand that attitudes about vote by mail are evolving. As a result, we will continue to track attitudes about vote by mail every month until Election Day to measure confidence, likelihood, and familiarity towards vote by mail amongst this critical group of voters. Next slide, please. So we're all here because we understand the overwhelming power of voters of color. We really hope this research informs your efforts to connect voters of color to their power, and we look forward to answering any questions that you might have about this research. Thank you all. Back to you, Jamal.
Thank you, Terrence. Thank you for that great overview. I'm going to introduce the panel right now so you guys know who else we're going to be talking to, and then I want to circle back to something. Joining us, you guys have already met Alphonso David, who's the president of the HRC Foundation. Also joining us is Mayra Macias, who is the executive director of Latino Victory, where she was previously the political director. Janet Murguía, president and CEO of UnidosUS, which was previously the National Council of La Raza, which I'm sure you've heard of. And then my homeboy from Detroit, Derrick Johnson, who is the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, but formerly also headed that branch in Mississippi for a long time. So I want to thank the entire panel for being here. We're going to come to you all with some pretty specific questions and to get your reaction to this research that Terrence has given us. But Terrence, I want to ask you as we get started, you gave us a lot to chew on. What are the couple of things that you, maybe 2 or 3 things max, that you think were the most impactful from what you saw in the research that you did? What jumped off the page to you?
You know, understanding that 75% of voters of color would consider voting by mail if there is not a cure or vaccine for coronavirus just really did reinforce just how urgent of a priority this is. That is an overwhelming majority of voters, and that should make this a top priority for all of us, and that's why I'm so glad that we're having this conversation.
Great. Alphonso, let me start with you here, because you guys hosted this conversation, and I really want to understand why it is you chose to do this. What was it that you saw that made the Human Rights Campaign Foundation decide to lead this, bring this group of people together, and to get this research done?
So we have done multiple research projects at the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. But unfortunately, what we saw as we looked at voting research specifically, is that there was very little to no focus on minority communities as it relates to vote by mail. We're facing a health pandemic, and we're also facing a legitimate struggle that we're having in this country with racial justice. And we have what I believe is the most consequential election of our lifetimes. And what we wanted to do is make sure that we talk to marginalized communities, and specifically Black, Latinx, and LGBTQ communities, about how they're going to approach this election. Because coronavirus, as we know, we're seeing huge spikes in certain parts of the country, and people are concerned. They're concerned about how they're going to make sure that their voices are heard at one of the most pivotal times in our nation's history. So we wanted to make sure we took a very comprehensive view, and a surgical view, if you will, at the perceptions and the obstacles and the opportunities that marginalized communities see as it relates to vote by mail. And so that's why we decided to do this research. And we wanted to do this with our partners who have done so much work in this space for so many decades.
It appears we've lost Jamal.
So given that we just lost Jamal, we'll go ahead and continue having the conversation. Maybe, Derrick, I'll just ask you a question about why you thought it was important for the NAACP, which is such a well-respected organization that has been focused on voting for such a long time, why you wanted to focus or do this work with us.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you and your leadership in this new position. I think it's extremely important in this juncture of our history that all of our groups align. This nation have had a long history of creating otherness. And that otherness is a system of maintaining domination and control and the outcome of elections. And elections are the single most factor which determines who control power, tax power, development, and all the things that impact our quality of lives. And so this project is really important, not only for the NAACP, it's important for all the communities we represent. November's election, I absolutely agree with you, Alphonso, is critically important. And I've heard it all of my life. But this time, it is as important as I've ever seen it. And it's not only the federal elections, it's elections up and down the ballot. The district attorney races in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery, that DA is on the ballot. We have to address the fact that she refused to bring those murderers to trial. The district attorney in Minneapolis was elected. We have to pay attention to DA races if we want to address incidents like George Floyd. But most importantly, we are in the midst of a health pandemic. And if we can get people to the polls, whether by vote by mail or in person, we must ensure that their health and safety is intact. Those horrific pictures in Wisconsin and in Milwaukee is something that we should never put citizens to have to choose between their health and their right to vote. But as some of the research have told us, this election is so critical, people are willing to risk their health because our lives depend on it. This election will be an outcome, will be a juncture where we determine whether we're going to stay in the past or move into the future. The NAACP, along with HRC and all of our partners, we want a future that's different than the past we've seen, especially over the last 3.5 years.
All right, I'm back from the exile of computer technology problems. Always happens at just the right time. Janet, I want to come to you because you've been doing this for a long time, and you have really been at the forefront of Latinx leadership on questions of justice and economics and all these questions. So what jumped out from what Terrence said to you and how you engaged voters and the communities that you focus on?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jamal. Glad to have you back. But I do also want to share my thanks to Alphonso for his leadership in coordinating this really important project, because I think what we're seeing and what we believe is that planning and preparation will equal participation. And we see the findings of this survey and the work done to put this data together, informing our efforts, but also of these collective organizations, so that we can keep the path to the voting booth unimpeded. Right now, and Derrick mentioned this, as did Alphonso, we're seeing obviously a threat to the health of our communities with this pandemic and with the failure of this administration to address it. But equally under threat is the threat to our democracy. And we have to make sure that we are taking the steps to inform our communities about what they can do in this new environment. The fact is like our African-American brothers and sisters, Latinos are overrepresented on the front lines of those responding to the pandemic and helping us all survive it. But we are also overrepresented in those getting sick and among those who are dying. And for us, we need to understand that that is a critical motivating factor for them to engage in our electoral process. We're at UnidosUS on the front lines registering so many in our community to vote, but making sure that as we register them, that we're also educating them about the options that they're going to have in this new environment, particularly early voting, vote by mail, something that they have not traditionally done, but as we see from the data, are very open to doing because they are concerned and anxious and nervous. They're hopeful and optimistic, but they are nervous about what this could mean for their health. So giving them information is critically important. And I'm just glad to be part of these wonderful organizations that are committed to doing that. It's going to be more important than ever before. And we need to see that kind of engagement. And the Latino community is going to be a critical factor in delivering votes across the country and in key states.
Myra, I want to turn to you now and pick up from where something Janet just said and pick up here. Why do you think so many Latinos, as we saw in the polling research, have questions about the election integrity? Why is that such a question in the community?
Well, first, I want to echo what my fellow panelists have said and thank Alphonso and the Human Rights Campaign team for convening such amazing organizations to do this critical work. And it's only fitting to share the virtual stage on the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act with such icons in our communities, advocacy to expand access to the ballot box. So Derrick, Janet, very humbling to be here. I also just want to apologize on behalf of Nathalie Reyes, our president CEO, who wanted to be here but couldn't make it. So I jokingly said you all got stuck with me instead. But to answer your question, Jamal, I mean, first off, many of our families come from countries that have a complicated relationship with our electoral system, or rather their electoral system. And so when we're thinking about introducing a new method of voting for most people, because vote by mail is not new, but most people have not really engaged, and certain states don't even really have it in place to the extent that states like Florida do. We have to remember that folks are carrying that trauma. Many people left their countries because they felt their government did not adhere to the integrity of the political process. And so we're starting at square one with a fraught history of engaging with electoral politics. And then two, we're 89 days away from the election. There are states in this country that still do not know what their vote by mail or election day plans are going to look like. And so if our secretaries of state are still figuring out, it makes the work of these organizations a lot harder to be able to educate folks about how to go about voting by mail when states are still trying to piece together their plans, which is why I think it's so important that we have this messaging and we're able to share it with secretaries of state. We're able to share it with organizations on the ground because we don't have a lot of time. And seeing the work that Terrence and the HIT Strategies team has done to really fine tune and show us which messaging is effective for communities of color, which messaging resonates with the Latino community, who again are coming to this with a complicated history of engaging with elections in our home countries. It should make it a lot easier, and this is so critically needed. And thank you all again for coming together to make sure that we're getting this message across to all of our respective communities.
Derrick, let me come back to you. One of the numbers that jumped off the page to me was this increasing amount of hopefulness that you see among African Americans. I think the number in there, Terrence, was about 41%. Why do you think African Americans are more hopeful at this moment where things, in some ways, seem so dire?
Because we can see light at the end of the tunnel. I think many individuals understand the risk that this administration placed on our communities, but we are 3.5 years of this tyranny, that's what I call it. And now November gives us an opportunity to change the dynamics. The level of racism and xenophobia that's been germinating from this White House has been unbearable. But now as we begin to turn the corner, there are signs that as a community, we can push the envelope much further. For the NAACP AC4, we don't endorse candidates, but we fight against hate. And we've seen so many messages of hate come from elected officials over the last 3.5 years. We have to fight back. And we win as a community, all of our communities, Blacks, Latinos, all of our communities, when we rest in places of hope. Fear would defeat us, but hope allow us to propel all of our neighbors, our family members to make the change we want to see.
You know, let's stay on this question of fear and hope. I think it's incredibly important. Janet, you know, I know a million years ago we worked on a political campaign together. Generations ago. You know, this idea of fear and hope, and I think we're seeing more hope start to come up in this election. Do you see that in the Latino community also, that maybe people are thinking, we've been through a lot over the last few years. We're going through a lot right now in terms of the virus. Maybe there's something brighter on the horizon.
No question, Jamal. It's absolutely true. And as nervous and anxious as some in our community may be, legitimately because of the health concerns, I think the more information, more education we do to address what we can do to create safe options, and again, offer this vote by mail and early voting as an opportunity. But I would just tell you, and Myra knows this too, we've worked together, the resiliency in our community is really something that's inspiring for all of us. We've not only been attacked by rhetoric, but by actions that have been taken, that have affected our community under this administration. But our community has never even considered throwing in the towel. We keep fighting, we keep moving forward. And what has made the difference, and Derrick and Alphonso touched on this, we're in this together. No longer do we feel like we're alone as a community looking out for our own interests. We're seeing not just multi-generational representation. We're seeing multiracial and multi-ethnic groups. And whether you're Black, white, brown, LGBTQ, we're seeing a growing movement out of this moment. And that is what I think our community draws on this. We've come together, understand that we have to come together, but we also see others joining in. And so that's very powerful and it's inspiring. And I think for our community, that resiliency will continue to pay off in political outcomes on election day.
Terrence, did I see you raise your hand, or are you just waving away a fly?
No, I was just agreeing. Agreeing.
Right.
There's absolutely a unity that is being perceived and felt through the protests, that the complexion of protests is diversifying, that young people of all stripes, all colors, and all backgrounds are taking a stance for Black lives. And that I do think that in the face of overwhelming division and incendiary rhetoric, that seeing that unity that sparked across the country is really inspiring a lot of hope and optimism in our community.
Maybe Myra, you could talk about the youth of our vote, of our voters in particular. You represent that group. No one better than to talk about our numbers and the way that our young people are coming together. If you don't mind, Jamal, I just think Myra,
no, this is a group conversation. Let's have at it.
It's been so key to seeing our young folks engage.
Definitely. And I think to Terrence's point, I mean, we're seeing such a unity amongst our young people. We saw it in folks standing up and uniting for the movement for Black Lives after George Floyd's tragic death and murder. But we also saw it when folks rallied around Vanessa Guillen. And this, I think this pandemic has really shed a light for so many people on the deficiencies that our institutions have had. And I think it's gotten to the point where people are fed up and understand that in order to enact change, in order to have tangible policy change in leadership, that we need to believe in our power and we need to believe in our ability to unite. And I've seen that so much with young voters. They're stepping up, not just in organizing, but stepping up and running for office, stepping up and organizing their communities. I mean, within the Latino community, we're seeing young people organize their parents, organize their older relatives who may not have access to the information that some of our younger constituents do. And so they're literally educating their family members on how to go about and find more information about policy points, but also about candidates and leaders within our community. And it is very inspiring. And at a time when there's so much darkness and so much negativity, it brings me a lot of hope to see how empowered our young people are and how they're really heralding a lot of the changes that we're seeing both on the ground, but also at the grass tops level.
Alphonso, I'm going to come back to you in about 7 seconds, but I do want to say, Myra, young Latino voters are incredibly important, but I also think two of the issues that have really brought people together from a variety of backgrounds have involved young Latinos. For instance, children at the border who've been separated from their parents. That was an issue that I think we saw people from all backgrounds, regardless of their race or ethnicity, really rally around. And also this issue of the Dreamers. I think people really feel like these are folks who deserve a chance at the American dream, just like everyone else. So I feel like the issue palette in America right now is really inclusive as people are wrestling through where we want to go as a country, regardless of who wins the election in November. Alphonso, so my question for you is, why make this research public? This is the kind of thing normally organizations like this would come together, do some research, share it with each other, and go forward and figure out how to use it. But you wanted to get it out to the entire public. Why is that?
Simple answer: we have to win, and we're not afraid of the light. I wanted to make sure that we communicate with our communities about the myths. People think in some cases that vote by mail is new. It is not new. It has existed for years. Some people think that vote by mail is riddled with fraud. Not true either. And I think part of the goal here is making sure that we communicate the results of this research so we can help, as I think Janet or Derrick mentioned earlier, that we are utilizing it to better effectively communicate with our communities about why it is so important for us to vote, what the facts are, because we shouldn't be sort of operating in a land of myths. And unfortunately, there's a lot of fear about vote by mail because it's been perpetuated by, someone that claims to be the president. And so we need to make sure that we are advancing clear facts about what vote by mail is, what the options are that are available. And I wanted to make sure that this information is publicly available to all of the organizations that are doing work on the ground. There are 4 organizations here represented, but there are many other organizations that are doing work on the ground that are communicating with specifically communities of color. And I have to also just make an additional point that often goes overlooked. Members of the transgender community are facing significant hurdles in voting. We see this, and we've seen this year after year after year with very strict voter ID laws that in some cases are being enforced in a very onerous and in some cases unconstitutional way. Nevertheless, we need to make sure that we're providing information to people so that they can exercise their constitutional right to vote. We all have the right to vote, but unfortunately there's so much misinformation that I want to make sure that the facts are actually provided to the organizations doing work on the ground.
Hey, Terrence, can I ask you a follow-up question? So I don't know if you hear it, I hear it. People are skeptical. A lot of people are skeptical about this vote by mail. I mean, I think, and I just want you to give us the research on this of people who feel like maybe, maybe these votes won't get counted, or there'll be some sort of shenanigans. I think you even pointed out a quote as you were going through your presentation. What's the research telling you about the skepticism that exists around vote by mail?
I mentioned this during the presentation. Voters of color have a justifiable level of cynicism towards our system. And when I asked in one of the focus groups, it was one of the most poignant quotes. I said, well, tell me exactly what it is about vote by mail or what it is that makes you not trust vote by mail. And she said, it's because I'm Black. Because I'm Black, I can't trust any of these things because I've seen how many ways they have tried to come between me and my vote. That said, she was still a very likely 100% voter. So to the earlier point, that cynicism is also being met with an overwhelming level of resilience, that they will not be rejected or denied or blocked from their right to vote. And so while there is some skepticism, specifically around whether or not votes will be counted properly, and unfortunately, that skepticism has a very loud microphone, and a lot of people are hearing it. And while they may not believe the messenger, they're beginning to repeat the message. And that is why it's incumbent upon us to start these education campaigns early. This is not something that we are going to be able to undo in the last 3 weeks of this election. They're hearing this every day. Every day they're hearing reasons to doubt this system, and we have to start reinforcing them. Because while they do have visceral doubts, just because of the cynicism that they have toward the system, their doubts are not intense. It doesn't take a lot to move them. We just have to start having the conversation. So
Derrick, you've been doing voting stuff for a long time. And so my question is, knowing there is some skepticism out there, is vote by mail the only policy solution that people should be pursuing? Or are there other ways to lower the barriers to voting that we should also be thinking about as we get closer to November?
Well, I think, the rules are set. I don't think we can change the rules of how we're going to engage for this election cycle. Where vote by mail will be available, we need to accelerate it to keep people safe. Where absentee balloting is the solution, we need to accelerate it to keep people safe. Where we have early voting or same-day voter registration, we need to accelerate access to the polling place. And when in November, after November, we really need to talk about how do we open up democracy for more people so the administration of the election is not weaponized and politicized to block people from the ballot box. For me, we're going to be pursuing a course of action to do just that. Why do we have polling places that are restrictive? Someone get off work and they drive past 2 or 3 polling places before they can cast a ballot. Any polling place within a county should be accessible to voters in that county. Polling places should be weighted so there's an equal number of polling places per county across the country, very similar to how you do redistricting, so you don't have some jurisdictions with fewer polling places and others with more than enough to reduce on lines. There should be a weighted approach on how many voting machines should be in a polling place so that you don't go to a polling place there's a long line because there's 2 machines and 2,000 people. Why do we have the elections on a work day? And in some states, the election is only 12 hours a day. People work 8 hours a day. That is a restrictive and aggressive approach to suppress the votes. We need to make election day either a holiday or move them to a weekend. And most importantly, during a health pandemic, we need to make sure we recruit younger poll workers to work the polls so that our most vulnerable in our communities are not subjected to a health scare, and make sure every poll worker are provided with PPE so we can protect not only the workers, but the voters. It shouldn't be this hard. Other nations get it right. Why can't we get it right?
Janet, how do we explain vote by mail to people in a way that they really can understand what they're doing and make this seem as easy as possible and as normal as possible to these voters?
Well, I think making sure that we're investing in organizations like the ones you see here, we are credible partners in these communities. We are credible voices. And yet, too often, not enough is done to make sure that cultural competencies and language, not just Spanish, but multiple languages, are used to engage voters and reassure them of what they need to know and when. Because let's admit this, I mean, this misinformation will continue to be rampant. We need trusted partners to be conveying the truth and getting that voter education across. And I have to tell you, I also think that the campaigns, whether it's at the national level or at the Senate level, they need to do a good job of making sure that they are engaging in essential outreach. That's really important. You know, we'll do our part and we need to be resourced to do it. But yeah, candidates matter, their positions matter, but also meaningful outreach. And I think one example, Jamal, you'll appreciate this, in the last 2 presidential elections, more than 60% of Latinos that were highly likely to vote reported that they had not heard from candidates and parties. You know, too often our community's voters are taken for granted, even by folks who are counting on our votes. Well, you can't make a false assumption that you can count on our votes without engaging our voters. And I just feel like it's important, as we're going to be hustling and working hard to make sure we're putting all of our efforts as organizations invested in strengthening our democracy and working to grow the political influence of our communities, that others aren't also doing their part there and making assumptions that it's just going to happen. We have to be intentional, and we have to be very vigilant in making sure we're getting that education effort started early, and now that we're doing it, recognizing language and cultural competencies.
Myra, as we close out here, I'm going to come back to Alphonso and let him take us home. But as we close out here, let me just ask you, we talked about youth voters and paying attention. Part of this research was done in Spanish. What's your recommendation to organizations that are focusing on this community and how they handle the language questions?
Well, 2 points. One thing that Terrence highlighted is just how effective it was for folks to hear from validators about the process. And as a former Floridian and someone who loves voting by mail, because it was so easy for me, who is working on election day, you know, I think having local validators, having organizations like NAACP, Unidos, Latino Victory, reaching out to our communities and saying, not only is this an option, but in this time of COVID, when Latinos and the Black community are disproportionately affected, Latinos are 4 times as likely to be hospitalized than their white counterparts, this is the safest option. And that message is resonating right now because people are paying attention. You know, folks are online more than ever before. And so we have to leverage our platforms to get that message across. Because as Derrick pointed out in his opening remarks, we have to safeguard our right to vote, but we also have to safeguard the health of our communities and resonate. And that message resonates with our community. And we need local validators that have the investment and engagement of partners to make sure that they're the ones conveying this information. And that is also reflected in conveying this information in language that is accessible. We know that not being dominant English speaking is already a hurdle for folks when they're trying to access information about voting. You know, having it in Spanish, but also having it culturally competent. Because one of the things that Janet, I'm sure, has spoken a lot about, and I feel like we sound like a constant broken record, is it is not enough to translate something. We have to make sure, right? Google Translate is not the move when you're engaging our communities in their respective languages. It has to be culturally competent because words have various meanings in different countries. And so relying on our local validators, local organizations to help lead this work is critical.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for being here. This is, I think, a really great panel, but I don't want to close it. I want to hand it over to our host with the most, Alphonso David. Thank you for having me be a part of this. And if you want to just take us out, take it away.
Thank you, Jamal. Thank you for hosting. Derrick, thank you for joining. Myra, thank you. And of course, Janet, Terrence, and Hate Strategies, thank you for doing all of this work. We have a history of oppression that people of color in this country are all too familiar with. But that history of oppression should not dictate our future. We have an opportunity to define our future this coming November. And we're hoping that this research will help us inform how we interact with each other, how we talk about the opportunities for voting, and how we can demystify the process and really embrace this constitutional right that we all have. So I hope that all of you watching, all of the organizations that we work with, and all of the organizations that are interested in working in the voting rights space, use this research to help us mobilize voters this election, because we need to make sure people are informed about the process, they're informed about their options, and that they utilize the tools that are available to them, the resources that are available to them, so that their constitutional rights, their constitutional right to vote, which we all have as citizens and residents in this country, is fully exercised. So thank you again for joining us tonight. And we hope that you take a look at the research which is posted on www.hrc.org, and you utilize that research in helping to inform members of the electorate. Thank you again for joining us.